So tonight I have the very pleasant but also impossible task of introducing someone who's already very well known and beloved by our church community. The Reverend David Wayland grew up in Segregated, Virginia. He attended VPI, now known as Virginia Tech, for 3 years, where he studied geological engineering. While at Virginia Tech, he discerned a call to ordained ministry. So he transferred to UVA for a better foundation in liberal arts in preparation for seminary. He graduated from Virginia Seminary, and beginning in 1962, he served over 30 churches in Virginia, Kentucky, Georgia, West Virginia, and Ohio. His wife, Jenny, and he moved back to Crozet in 1992 to take over the family's home place and orchard. For about 10 years, he continued to serve area Episcopal churches and be part-time chaplain at Westminster Canterbury of the Blue Ridge. Jenny and he have traveled extensively, including a trip to the Soviet Union 3 days after Chernobyl. They have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. David and Jenny have been faithful participants in our racial reconciliation group. They have shared with our group several stories in which they have witnessed racism throughout their lives. Our group has been touched by their openness and honesty about some very difficult experiences they have had. I'm so happy to welcome David tonight as he shares some of his personal stories of being a Southerner tackling racism.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Now? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, that's good. I can hear myself. Would you say I served 30 some different churches? No, I served a number of churches for 30 some years, but they didn't throw me out of quite that many churches, I have to tell you. Yeah, I really appreciate being invited to be part of this program, and it stems out of being in the racial reconciliation group that we were meeting for a year or two, I guess it was several years. Being in that group and reading Waking Up White and White Fragility and some of those other books made me want to look at my own racial history. I grew up in Crozet, which is probably a typical Southern town. You all know where it is. I went to Crozet Elementary School and went then to Lane High School because the Crozet School was pretty insufficient, and on from there to VPI and on to seminary, Virginia, and then to seminary. I enjoyed watching Myra Anderson's presentation last week, and I got thinking that there's some very definite parallels between her story and my story, but quite different. Also, her ancestors came to America as enslaved people from Africa. My ancestors came to America as indentured, probably as indentured servants under Governor Spotswood around 1719. The wonderful thing that I have as a white person and as someone who came out of the Germana colony is that a huge amount of research was done on my ancestry, and I can trace my father's line, the Wayland line, all the way back at least to 1540 and maybe even earlier than that. And there's a lot of documentation for that, whereas Myra had to do a tremendous amount of work and research to find out about her ancestry and to share it as generously as she did last week. Spotswood brought these German iron workers over into Culpeper area and trying to run the iron mines. And my ancestors, I'm pretty sure, came in 1719, were iron workers. The mines didn't work out, and the Germanic colony broke up, and a lot of the Germans scattered. And I can trace my ancestry. In fact, I may have been on their farm trying to find it down through Madison County and then into Albemarle County, and then others scattered all over the place, including particularly Missouri and Kentucky. My great-great-grandfather was Jeremiah Wayland, and he bought a home in Crozet, and around 1820, when he was about 23 years old. That house was torn down 2 years ago, and we tried to save it, but we did not. But I got interested since he ran this farm, if you know Crozet, it was back behind where the bank and the post office are, and I've been on the property quite a bit. And the cemetery, the Wayland Cemetery, is there, though the headstones were moved by my uncles a number of years ago over to Rockgate Cemetery. I wondered about Jeremiah and his son, Abram, or Abraham. Everybody called him Abram, and Jeremiah was known as Jerry. I've researched that. I found out that Jeremiah owned seven slaves. I was able to research that. There were 6 men and 1 woman. And in the census records after about 1850, he only owned 2 people, a man, what looks like from the records, a man and a woman. And Phil James, who does the history of Western Albemarle, he and I did some research, and I think we've identified the names of those 2 people. And my Aunt Nancy, who lived to be 104 and remembered those freed slaves living on the farm in around 1890, she knew that their names are Harriet and Simon. So I had that connection with that, and I knew that these people had stayed on the farm, but it didn't bother me. Well, it bothered me that they were slaves, but what bothered me more is there's no cemetery that we have ever been able to find where they might be buried. And they lived up until about 1890 something. I don't have the right date. Now I remember my grandfather, Jeremiah's grandson, who's my grandfather. He was well known in Crozet, Charlie Wayland, Charles Lee Wayland. And the interesting thing is, I knew him, I remember him vividly, and my grandfather was alive during the Civil War. It's sort of hard to believe that I shook hands and hugged a man who was alive. He was born in 1861, but what a long period of time when you live to be as old as I am. And I'm 85, so I'm proud of that. So it doesn't bother me to say that I knew him when I was in high school, and he lived until I was in high school in Charlottesville. Now, my family ran an orchard in Crozet, and my father was known as an orchardist, a peach grower primarily, Wayland Orchard. A lot of people today even still remember that. And I inherited that orchard in 1992 when we moved back to Virginia. I grew up in that orchard. My father had 4 or 5 tenant houses on the property, and 2 or 3 of them had Black families living in them. As the son of the owner, and I was sent out into the orchards to work, and I still remember those experiences pretty vividly, because I would work with both Blacks and whites in the orchard during the summer months. And my one thing that I wanted very much was to have a chaw of tobacco, because they all chawed tobacco, and I'll never forgive them because they well, maybe I should thank them. They gave me a chaw of tobacco, and it was the worst thing I ever put in my mouth. I can still taste it, I think. But I worked alongside of Blacks. But what I want to say throughout all of this, about up until into my 30s or 40s, I'm a Southerner, and I had racial attitudes, but they weren't ugly. They weren't, I wasn't nasty or dirty, or I didn't mistreat people. I just, we lived in 2 separate universes. I knew there were Blacks who worked for my dad, and there were people I saw, but I didn't have any much to do with any of them, and we sort of lived separate lives, separate worlds. I never was in public school with a Black person until I guess it was my first or second year in college. It was the first time I ever sat in a classroom with a Black person, and he became a friend. I knew him at BPI. I didn't follow through on that, but I remember the experience of that's the first time I've ever had Blacks, or Negroes, as we called them in those days. Now, my father treated the Blacks that worked for him with generosity, and he took care of, and I'll tell you a story about that. But at home, at the dinner table in the house, we had a colored maid who helped out, but we never sat at the same table and ate at the same time. My father called them the N-word at home, away from them. I grew up hearing the N-word, and I don't look back on it as a slur or put down, though it probably would seem that way to probably most everybody today. He treated them right, and the woman who worked for us, his name was Gladys Barber, was well known around Crozet even after we moved back here in '92. He went out of his way and bought her Social Security and paid both sides of the Social Security. And later in the mid 90s, I was sitting with her talking, and she had to be in her 90s. She said, she called me Mr. Wayland. She said, "Mr. Wayland, your dad, Mr. Wayland, paid for my Social Security, and that's all I'm living on today. And if he hadn't done that, I don't know what I would be doing today." And that was the way he was, though she was a colored person, and he used, I don't know about her, but he did about certain other Blacks, he used the N-word. I didn't have much experience with Blacks, colored people, as we said in those days. But when I got to seminary, there was 2 or 3. There was Virginia Seminary in Alexandria. There were Blacks in my class, and we got to know some of them quite well. In fact, one of them, we became friends, and I actually double dated with him and our dates of he dated a black woman. I dated a white, and we even double dated in Richmond, Virginia in 1962 or 3, I guess it was. My first experience with really dealing with racism was when another student at Virginia Seminary came back and said that he had been denied food at a restaurant in Alexandria, and he was very insulted by it, and so a bunch of us went down there, and this would be about 1961, and we had a sit-in. I sat at the counter with others, and nothing bad came of it, but we took a stand, and that was the first time I can think that I took a stand. I had been to any number of conferences during my years at Tech and at UVA, and they were ecumenical conferences, usually over Christmas time, and be at on different college campuses, and I did have the opportunity, and it didn't mean that much to me at the time, but I remember it. A group of us were with Martin Luther King Jr. He was a speaker at the conference, and after one of the sessions, we sort of ganged up on him in a classroom or something, and heard him talking. I can visualize that real easily. And I remember someone asked him, he said, what do you think of blacks and whites marrying? What do you think about that? And he said, he said something to this effect, races don't marry, individuals marry. And for that reason, we don't have to worry about it. So, my sort of latent under the surface racism or bigotry that I grew up with as a child, like the doctor's office, I remember had black and colored and white restrooms, water fountains, and waiting rooms. The thing I remember the Vinegar Hill in Charlottesville on Main Street when it was active was a black business district, and most of us knew you just didn't go over there. That was the black part of town. And Railroad Avenue and Crozet from the crossroads down to Morton's was the black section of town, and you just that was their place to live, and you sort of observed that and watched it. But we lived parallel lives, and it wasn't really until I think I was in seminary or beyond seminary that I got really more attuned to what was going on. And of course, society had changed by the mid-60s. I was rector of Buck Mountain Church in Earlsville around 1960, what would it have been, 1965. And I got approached by some of the university chaplains, both Methodist, Presbyterian, and Episcopal here in town, to go with them to Selma, Alabama on the bus because we needed to make a stand down there. I remember being invited to go on the bus there, and I remember specifically thinking and saying, that's not my business. I don't need to be involved with that. And I didn't go. Later, we all know what happened. They had 3 marches, I think, over the bridge. When I was in seminary, or right after seminary, 1963, we had the famous March on Washington. I had a good friend from Oklahoma. He and I wasn't married at the time. He wasn't either. And we were in Washington, D.C. the week that Martin Luther King spoke at the Lincoln Memorial. Now, you would think I'd be right on the front line listening to that. No, he and I got in the car and we went to Rehoboth Beach and went to the beach because I just, at that point, I wasn't quite sure where I was and what I really believed and whether I wanted to make a stand. I think what really changed my life, and I need to give her credit, is Jenny, my wife. We were married in 1964, and she came out of Norland, Virginia, and had gone to a high school and college there and at Penn State. And when we were married, she brought with her a whole different idea about how people should be, how Blacks should be treated. And her influence in my life has certainly been a very strong factor in what I've stood for and how I've changed. There were a couple other things that I should mention. I'm not sure. As early in my ministry, the first two of the first three churches I served were racist. And one of them was here in Albemarle County. And I tried to get the churches out in rural northern Albemarle County to have a well baby clinic in the vestry. A 5-person vestry voted 2-0, with 3 abstaining, that they didn't want Blacks coming into the church building. And they didn't want a well baby clinic out in that rural area. The other 3 in the parking lot said they were all in favor of it, but they didn't want to vote. I invited the clinic to come, and probably got into a lot of trouble for doing that, but I thought that was the right thing to do. But the worst thing that happened was I was also rector of Trinity Church in Rocky Mount, Virginia, sitting in a vestry meeting in the library of the church, and someone comes through the door to us and says, oh, you won't believe it. Martin Luther King was just assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And we all sat there stunned. And then the vestry broke into applause. I didn't get up, much to my chagrin. I didn't get up and leave the room. We went on, I guess, with the meeting, but I went home, and that Sunday I'd written a sermon dealing with what had happened, and a whole group of us clergy, 3 or 4 of us, had met to console each other and share our grief. And we all preached a version of that same sermon that Sunday in the Rocky Mountain, a lot of the Rocky Mountain churches, Methodist, Disciples of Christ, and Presbyterian, I remember for sure. That was an Episcopal vestry, and they represented, and probably maybe would even today, I don't know. I haven't stayed in touch with Trinity. I did stay there another year or 2, and then moved to a church in Northern Kentucky from there. Those things get to you. I mean, I never dreamed that people would feel that strongly about something. Well, I didn't believe anybody would raid the Capitol building either until I saw it happen, and it's just hard to take. What I want to say in all this is that I've gradually changed thanks to experiences and influences that I've had along the way. Proof of some of my own attitude is the fact that what we have a Chinese and a Ethiopian grandchild. 2 of my children married. One married someone from China and someone from Thailand. The fact that, and that's of course a lot of Jenny's influence there, but the fact that I've been open to other cultures, when I took a sabbatical, we went to the Soviet Union, as was mentioned earlier. It was a culture I wanted to learn more about, and we spent 3 weeks in the Soviet Union in 1985 or 86 when Chernobyl, right after Chernobyl had blown. But anyway, the Holy Spirit works on all of us. I certainly am no example of anything other than a Southerner who has been able to have different experiences that have allowed me to grow and to change and to be aware of the difference in the different cultures and how our own education and experiences have shaped us to be the people we are. I'm honored to be able to talk like this, but I certainly don't set myself up, and I know none of you do either, as an example of anything other than slow growth and openness to the work of the Spirit in my own life. And that's about it. There are a lot of other stories, but that's all you need to hear. Okay.